we are very, very privileged this morning in the speaker that we have coming to us. Alexander Astin is the Alan M. Carter Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Higher Education and the founding director of the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA. He's also the founding director of the Cooperative Institutional Research Program, and the author of, if you can imagine, 22 books and some 300 other publications in the field of higher education. I've got some catching up to do. Previously, he served as the Director of Research for both the American Council on Education and the National Merit Scholarship Corporation. Dr. Astin has been a recipient of awards for outstanding research from 13 national associations, a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, and a recipient of 11 honorary degrees. He's a member of the National Academy of Education. The Journal of Higher Education, in both 1990 and 2010, identified Dr. Astin as the most frequently cited author in the field of higher education. In 1985, readers of Change magazine selected him as the person, quote, most admired for creative, insightful thinking in higher education. His most recent books include MindWorks, Becoming More Conscious in an Unconscious World, Cultivating the Spirit, How Colleges Can Enhance Students' Inner Lives, and Assessment for Excellence, The Philosophy and Practice of Assessment in Evaluation in Higher Education. So please welcome with me Dr. Alexander Astin.
Thanks, Chris. I was just thinking last night that we have, we're really being treated to two different kinds of conferences. One having to do with how do you use technology to teach better, and the other is sort of the more kind of macro concern about technology taking over traditional undergraduate education. The kind of issues that Peter Hadrius was talking about yesterday, and I'm going to talk about that second issue, but I just wanted to say it's been an education for me to hear folks like Professors Work, Wilson, how do you pronounce Juhas? U.S., okay. And Locke. So I just wanted to offer my appreciation to you folks who are in the trenches, really using technology to make things better for students. Now, distance learning of the sort that Peter was talking about yesterday represents a potentially inexpensive alternative to traditional face-to-face instruction, but whether it should constitute the high-tech future of undergraduate education in the liberal arts is open to serious question. And this isn't just a kind of philosophical position or theoretical position of mine. It's based on evidence that I'm familiar with from literally thousands of empirical studies of college students that have been done in the past half century. These longitudinal studies have looked at a wide range of student outcomes, including the acquisition of skills and knowledge, career choice, degree completion, aspirations, values, attitudes, satisfaction with college, and postgraduate life. The research has repeatedly identified specific educational experiences that tend to promote positive outcomes for students. And here's just a sampling of these. Frequent interaction with faculty, student-student interaction, co-curricular activities, service learning, and by the way, I think the history, our experience with service learning in many ways parallels the history or the recent history of attempts to use technology in the classroom in a creative way. And indeed, before service learning got really widespread, we had collaborative learning. And I think there are some parallels or crossover among these three different movements, the cooperative learning movement and the service learning movement and the technology in the classroom. Is there some problem here?
The display's backwards.
It started out all right.
It did, and then it reversed itself somehow, Sandy, so thanks for your patience.
Okay. I'm going to put this up here where okay. I'm not able to, oh, did I unplug it? Oh, that's not going to make any difference. I can't get the thing to,
There it goes again.
I would be the one to screw up the technology. You hear that? I don't really need these charts, but it's always nice to have some pictures.
Oh, you
So,
brought it. I might as well use them.
Okay. Anyway, this is just a sampling of some of the things we found. There, study abroad. There are a lot of other very interesting. But the point is that if you look at these kinds of experiences, where are they in a MOOC? I can't find them anywhere, at least in the kinds of MOOC-only courses that we've heard about. So if we're going to subject this expanding student population to a MOOC-based liberal education, we're going to deprive them of most of the stuff that works, that matters in terms of student development, and that's very troubling and raises all kinds of equity issues in my mind. Now, there have even been some attempts to study different varieties of general education in terms of course content, and nothing seems to make much difference in terms of these outcomes, except one form of general education that I call the Common Core curriculum. And when the students have all had the same set of courses, this enhances the learning outcomes. And we think this has to do with the fact that it makes it possible for students to interact with each other around the curriculum content. So if you sit down with a random student in the student union and have a coffee, you've had the same courses. The St. John's model, that kind of, everybody takes the same courses. And that does seem to enhance it. But again, why? Because it takes advantage of the peer group possibilities. A common thread that runs through all of these good practices or positive experiences for students is what has come to be known as student involvement. Some people have come along later and call it engagement now, but it's the same thing. The process whereby the student invests time and energy in activities related to the educational process. Old industrial psychologists used to call it time on task. But the basic idea is investing one's psychic and physical energy and time in an activity, in this case, in education. And a key factor in higher education in enhancing this kind of involvement is exposure to the peer group. I hate to say this to my colleague professors, but it may be that students teach each other more stuff than we teach them. My guess is that's the case. Now, research on college student development has shown that student involvement is one of the main issues related to students dropping out of college, or should I say, lack of involvement. So if, again, there seems to be all this concern about degree completion now, if we convert our traditional liberal arts education to a MOOC-based education, we're going to have massive increases in student dropouts. Now, there's an issue here that hasn't come up in the meeting, but I think it's fundamental to all of these conversations. And it's the issue of what do we mean by a liberal education? Just what do we have in mind when people talk about this? Most people, and this goes for people in the media, policymakers, legislators, and so forth, believe that such an education can be defined simply in terms of course credits. Students take such and such an array of courses in these fields, pass them, and ipso facto, they've been liberally educated. Doesn't matter how one acquires the requisite credits or degrees in one institution or in 5, in 4 years or 15 years, as a resident or a commuter, through part-time attendance or full-time attendance, in classes of 20 students or 500 students, with a lot of peer interaction or no peer interaction, with a lot of faculty contact and no faculty contact, with heavy co-curricular involvement or no such involvement. It doesn't matter. Just collect the right credits and you're done. This view equates liberal education with course content. A liberally educated person is thus one who has been exposed to, I'm a little ahead of myself here, who has been exposed to certain course content. It's also the view embraced by those who advocate replacing traditional undergraduate education with MOOCs or other forms of distance learning. Such recommendations often come from state policymakers and politicians who, of course, are worrying about the escalating costs of higher education. In trying to appreciate the positive possibilities inherent in MOOCs and distance learning, it can be helpful to provide a little historical context. As a matter of fact, the concepts of distance learning and the MOOC are not really all that new and different when you consider educational technologies that have a much longer history. I'm thinking here of B.F. Skinner's teaching machines and his notion of programmed instruction that were briefly in vogue in the 50s and 60s, what came to be known as computer-assisted instruction, CAI, that also enjoyed considerable popularity in the 60s and 70s. And of course, we've had the capability of filming for 100 years and of videotaping for 50 years. But the instructional technology with the longest history in education, and I got preempted yesterday by one of our conversations, is the textbook. Many of the purported advantages of MOOCs and distance learning are also provided by the textbook. And I'm speaking here of convenience, low cost, an opportunity for self-paced learning, ease of reviewing material, and a chance to learn from the best minds in the field, Harvard philosophy professors. And we're all familiar with stories of eccentric people, these Horatio Alger stories, who disliked school, who hated school, but they were able to obtain a great education in the public library. People from New York City are especially prone to do that. To my mind, the suggestion that we can replace traditional undergraduate education in the liberal arts with MOOCs or some other form of distance learning isn't all that different from advocating that we dispense with professors and classrooms altogether and equip each student instead with a teaching machine and a library card. Given that we've had the capability of doing just that for a long time, why hasn't it been given more serious consideration? And why are so many people now suggesting that traditional face-to-face learning should be supplanted by distance learning, especially if we expect to be able to expand higher education opportunities? I might add that the only way that you can rationally defend that kind of a policy is if you adopt a course content view of undergraduate education and liberal education. So those two things are linked. If we're only talking about course content, no matter how we, whether it's the banking model where we withdraw it from the head of the professor and deposit it in the head of the student, or whatever the method is, the textbook or whatever, that way of looking at liberal education is what makes it possible to consider the sorts of things that the San Jose State president was advocating. I suspect that it's mostly about money. State budgets are in very rough shape, and of course higher education is a great target for cuts, especially by conservative state legislators who've always had an axe to grind with academicians. I think because they see them as all too ready to apply their highly developed critical thinking skills to the political process. But that's probably not just a joke. I think it's also true. Some of these same legislators are also enamored by the prospects of an expanded higher education system that features large-scale offerings from profit-making institutions, and a system that also relies heavily on the products of high-tech industries. The purveyors of courseware, of course, are among the most vigorous cheerleaders for distance learning, not to mention those private philanthropies that were founded with high-tech money. They'll go unnamed, but you know the ones I'm talking about. Of course, for working adults and some part-time students, MOOCs represent a potentially attractive way to expose themselves to certain types of course content without the bother and inconvenience of commuting, parking, and navigating around a large campus. But whether the quality and quantity of learning of that content would be comparable to that of a traditional course, and whether the likelihood of course completion would be comparable, are empirical questions that we still don't have any answers for. We also need to acknowledge that for traditional age students attending college full-time, there may be some circumstances in which a MOOC can provide a relatively inexpensive alternative to class, particularly if it happens to be a large lecture course where opportunities for questions and discussions are limited. But it's still subject to some of the limitations that Peter mentioned last night. For most other types of courses, however, it's difficult to see how a MOOC could even begin to replicate the richness and learning potential of traditional campus-based instruction, especially in light of the research findings that I've cited. If we want to preserve what's really valuable about a liberal arts education, there's a real danger to the course content approach. One has only to visit a few college websites to realize that we in higher education are dedicating ourselves to a diversity of student outcomes that have very little to do with course content. Qualities, just to give you a sampling, qualities such as leadership, citizenship and social responsibility, self-understanding, critical thinking, empathy, honesty. In other words, a liberal education is supposed to facilitate the development of such qualities not merely through exposure to course content, but particularly through personal interactions among students and faculty, the residential experience, student activities, and similar campus experiences. In contrast to those who would view liberal education narrowly in terms of course content, a growing number of educators have been calling for a more holistic or integral education, pointing to the need to connect excuse me, to connect mind and spirit, and to return to the true values of a liberal education, one that examines learning and knowledge in relation to an exploration of the self and of one's responsibilities to self and to others. I'm speaking here of something very close to what Howard Gardner has called existential intelligence. In debating MOOCs and related pedagogical issues related to the use of technology, as educators and citizens, we need to ask ourselves, what kinds of people will our global society of the future need? We need to ask ourselves this question all the time. It goes without saying that technical knowledge and skill are becoming increasingly important for effective functioning in our modern society, but technical knowledge alone won't be adequate for dealing with societal problems like violence, poverty, crime, divorce, substance abuse, and the religious, national, and ethnic conflicts that continue to plague our country and the world. At root, these are problems of the heart, problems that call for greater self-awareness, self-understanding, equanimity, empathy, and concern for others. Now, if these policymakers and politicians who are promoting MOOCs and other forms of distance learning as relatively inexpensive ways to accommodate the expected increases in student enrollment succeed in their quest, we can be sure that existing inequities in educational opportunities will be exacerbated. A considerable body of research shows that our state systems are already highly stratified, with most flagship universities enrolling disproportionately small numbers of poor students, African Americans, Latinos, and other underrepresented groups. And despite decades of generous financial aid programs and affirmative action admissions programs, the numbers of poor students attending selective institutions has remained at a very low level. About half of what you would expect if it were proportionate. Moreover, there's evidence to suggest that in recent years an increasing number of students from middle-income families are being squeezed out of the most selective institutions. And who's taking their place? More affluent kids. If we attempt to accommodate a growing population of traditional age students through the use of MOOC-driven liberal education programs, the considerable opportunity gaps that already exist in the United States will almost certainly grow wider. Disproportionate numbers of poor students, first-generation students, and students from underrepresented minority groups will be denied the unique benefits that research has shown to be associated with, with traditional undergraduate education. The large-scale non-interactive MOOC is the worst kind of pedagogy to subject an underprepared student to. You know, a well-prepared student might well do fine, but an unprepared student is not going to do well. There's little question that MOOCs and other technological innovations have the potential to enhance the quality of student experience, but in most cases, I'm not persuaded except by some kind of flipped course. Otherwise, I haven't seen any example that seems to persuade me that there's anything comparable to a face-to-face kind of experience. And now, in pursuit of the goal of expanding the use of MOOCs, we can only hope that the educators and policymakers who push this will familiarize themselves with some of the research that I've mentioned. However, the same research evidence suggests that MOOCs and distance learning should not be employed as alternative approaches, especially for the 1.5 million 18 and 19-year-olds who start college on a full-time basis every fall. You know, we talk romantically about, oh, the new student and the traditional student is a thing of the past. With still 1.5 million young people are starting college on a full-time basis every fall. That's not small potatoes. Those who advocate replacing traditional approaches to liberal learning and mass applications of distance learning are, of course, motivated primarily, as I've said, by economic considerations. Incidentally, and this is a completely irrelevant comment, but we've had several nice discussions about it out of the formal presentations. The claim that college costs are too high, which has become a part of our conventional wisdom, can be shown to be without any basis. I won't take time in these formal remarks to show why this is so, but I'd be pleased to comment on it during the discussion if you folks have any interest. I bring it up here because I think the time has come for colleges and universities to begin to challenge this widespread belief. In closing these formal remarks, I'd like to point out that the philosophy underlying the notion of a liberal education is in many ways a tribute to the power of the peer group. Students learn by interacting with each other, debating, reflecting, and discussing not only subject matter, but also their personal values, beliefs, and aspirations. This form of education implicitly assumes that an excellent education is much more than a collection of course credits, one that aims to deliver on its promise to educate the whole student. The broad formative roles that colleges and universities continue to play in our society, combined with their long-term commitment to the ideals of liberal learning, position them well to help students realize their full potential as citizens and parents and to better serve their communities, the society, and the world at large. Well, I'll stop here and entertain. Well, I guess we're taking a break.
Yes.
Okay.